get started as soon as I stop sneezing, the pollen. All right. Welcome, everybody. This is an exciting session today for our local champions cohort. We're going to be talking about agriculture in the era of climate change. And today we have 3 guest speakers, and we're going to each let them present for about 15 minutes each. And then we're going to go into our breakout rooms so that you can really pick their brains in a conversational way and talk about what's going on in your own towns. And it should be really fun. So maybe for now, if you have questions as they're presenting, sketch those down, and we'll handle questions in the breakout rooms if that's okay. So let's start with Andy Bicking, who oversees Scenic Hudson's engagement with local, state, and federal government officials, and directs the grassroots and legislative lobbying. So he's been in Albany just recently doing just that. He's the recipient of the Land Trust Alliance's National Ambassadors Award for his advocacy work. And he's advocated for the passage of legislation critical to the Hudson Valley's way of life, including the Community Preservation Act, which, if I'm not mistaken, is for Ulster County, the Petroleum Bearing Vessel Avoidance Zone Act. So that has to do with Hudson River, and New York's Bottle Redemption Law, and the Federal Farm Bill and Highlands Conservation Act. So he advises really multiple state and federal coalitions, all working on the intersection of these issues. Today, we really want him to be discussing with us the policy landscape as it relates to agriculture and climate change. And there's a lot happening in that area. So we're really looking forward to his point of view, and thank him for taking the time and spending his time with us today. And Andy, why don't you take it away? Share your screen.
Yeah, thanks so much, Vanessa and Paige, for convening us. And it's great to see some familiar faces here on the call, and also some new folks who I haven't met before. So hello. Really excited to get to know you. And I just think, well, kicking things off, I'm so excited about this partnership that you all have engaged in. I think it really puts you on the cutting edge of the issue of how government can engage in climate issues, not just in the Hudson Valley in New York State, but honestly throughout the Northeast. You know, so many of the groups that I'm speaking with around the country would just be so envious to have such strong local leadership and nonprofit leadership that you've seen through HV lifeboats and your local communities. So congratulations to all of you. I hope today can be a really constructive, forward-looking conversation. And I'd like to really focus most of my remarks on the area of climate change and agriculture that relates to carbon sequestration. But just to kick things off, when we think about it, there's a lot of issues at play, right? There's the role of agriculture in reducing its carbon outputs and its greenhouse gas outputs. We tend to think about that as mitigation. You know, there's a broader land use issue of how do we site renewables and how do we strike the right balance between the farms that need to feed us and getting renewables sited. There's been a lot of discussion about that. I know my colleague Audrey Fredrickson spoke to you a few weeks back about that issue. Again, we really want to focus on is this issue of how do we work with the agricultural community and work on their soils to literally help solve the climate crisis. So what I'm going to show you tonight are a few slides that I actually presented last night to a group of climate activists in the Hudson Valley. I'm not going to hit all of them at the same level of detail, but just out of curiosity, did anyone happen to tune into that presentation last night? It was sponsored by Climate Reality Project and Citizens Climate Lobby. Good, so this won't be redundant, so I'm glad for that. So just to jump through things here really quickly, addressing climate change through the management of ag lands is complex undertaking that really needs to be looked at holistically from our perspective. The science tells us that crop management practices are an emerging area of research, and they at the same time have huge potential to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and absorb carbon. There's a lot of unanswered questions in the scientific front, especially around the issue of how to measure carbon sequestration, how to verify that it's taking place. But at the same time, the climate crisis is so severe that we need to start our work on this issue now and figure out ways to incentivize the adoption of smart climate change practices on farms while the science is also being developed. The economics and social dynamics around this opportunity are also critical to consider. From a regional perspective, farmers control or own or operate on about 18% of the region's landscape. And fundamentally, if we're asking them to be part of the climate solution, we're asking them to change their business practices. And we need to be aware that there's a profit margin kind of question that comes up. And so our solutions really need to be designed with the viability of farm businesses in mind. And also to recognize that some of the things we need to talk about go right to the heart of the American psyche, such as what the role is of private enterprise in creating public good. At the same time, public policy has enormous potential to guide this discussion in every jurisdiction. And we know that the only way true change occurs in a democracy is through community action. And so we all have an opportunity to weigh in and have our voices heard. I think this group probably knows a lot about climate science in general, so I'll skip over these slides and I'll just suffice to say that the kind of core theory of change here is well documented in scientific literature. At the most basic level, if you think about the compounds that are driving climate change, carbon, nitrous oxide in particular, they also have the potential to be food for plants. And if we can harness the natural processes that farmers have been working with for tens and thousands of years and harness the scientific understanding and the understanding of the economics and culture around this issue, we really have the potential to make some really positive change. The element of this discussion that's really important to think about is how we talk about it. I know Elizabeth will probably get into this a little bit, but there's real value in thinking about it, not just from a climate perspective, but also what the co-benefits are. Fundamentally, we're talking about soil health, which also brings with it a lot of benefits such as increased productivity and also water quality. There is a lot, I think, on the economics and cultural side that I'd like to talk about. The science is critical to our understanding of this opportunity, but we have to balance it with an understanding of the economic systems that have got us where we are today. In a nutshell, since World War II and the Green Revolution, public policy has really encouraged farmers to use chemical intervention to reduce labor, fight pests, fight weeds, and provide nutrition to crops. And more than 75 years of policy around this has let us be tremendously effective at feeding people. And that's a benefit that we want to keep. At the same time, the literature increasingly tells us that many of these practices, not all, but many of them, have a variety of negative environmental impacts that are associated with them that we want to manage and try to reduce. So a little bit about healthy soil systems, what they look like and what changes many people are beginning to think about needing to make at a very broad scale. Some practices known as low-till are characterized by cover cropping. Just to give a few examples, create many benefits and address the problems mentioned earlier. They also help absorb carbon and nitrous oxide. And fundamentally, they work by increasing the organic matter content of soil, which helps maintain the integrity and networks of microorganisms that make soil their home. And this has the effect of holding carbon and other compounds in the ground. The approach also has the co-benefit of stabilizing topsoil and preventing unnecessary loss of water and soil moisture. There's a lot of ways these practices have been talked about over the years, and depending who you talk to in the agricultural or policy community, you may hear terms like resilient, climate resilient agriculture, or regenerative agriculture, or organic agriculture. But they all these terms, while there are differences and nuances, they have many things in common. You know, they encourage productive soils. They help land be resilient in the face of climate change. They minimize negative environmental impacts, et cetera. So it's important just to be aware of those terms as you enter into discussions. I also think it's really important to think about what it would mean to put some of these practices in place in the regional context in the Hudson River Valley. And important to understand a few things at a high level. You know, first, all farms in our region are not the same. They're all very different depending on what they produce, you know, their history, the type of land, the type of soil they have. But just broadly speaking, you know, economically, the region is well positioned. And while there has been some upsets in the past year due to the pandemic, you know, we have a tremendous opportunity to tap New York City-based markets and a very educated consumer base, which can be really helpful. We also have really strong natural resources in the region, and because our farms tend to be smaller scaled and tend to be family owned, Hudson Valley farms are about half the average size of New York, and New York is about half the average size of the nation. We actually have a unique ability to pivot quickly and adapt. And our human resources are just outstanding too. We have great, very well-educated, smart farmers, a lot of family-owned farms. And just to give one example, we're the birthplace of the National Young Farmers Movement right up in Columbia County. So a lot of great human capital to tap and leverage in these discussions. But with a basic understanding of science and economics as our foundation, it's important to think about how to make the case to farmers. And what I really want to encourage everyone to think about is the kind of mantra, voluntary incentives for soil health practices. And those words are chosen very carefully based on a lot of social science research. I know in your packet prior to the meeting, I had shared with Paige and Vanessa a study Scenic Hudson commissioned in 2016 or 2017 called Climate Resilient Agriculture, Cultivating Climate Solutions in the Hudson Valley. And at its core, we found through that research effort conducted by a nationally known academic, the importance of providing technical education and support to farmers around these issues, the importance of, again, communicating about co-benefits, recognizing that not everyone in the agricultural community may embrace the notion of climate change. We need to approach them on kind of what the idea of what's in it for them and what are the co-benefits that they might receive for putting some of these practices in place. We also found that voluntary programs are generally perceived most favorably by farmers, as is encouraging collaboration between research and practitioners to make sure that the science stays relevant to the reality of the farm economy. And finally, this is probably one of the most important points. There's a broadly recognized need to provide financial incentives for the uptake of these practices. Fundamentally, again, farms are businesses. They're trying to make a living. And if we're going to ask or try to encourage them to do things differently, it represents a cost. And we need to find a way to address that. There are few market-based mechanisms that exist to make up that investment that's required. But there are huge opportunities through public policy, whether it's grants or tax policy or zoning, where you could be providing the straw that breaks the camel's back, so to speak. That's the wrong metaphor, but just that little bit extra that may make it worth the farmer's while to put these practices in place. Generally, on the New York State, we're well positioned to make change. A lot of good stuff is happening. You're probably all aware of the new climate law and its call for an 85% reduction in carbon emissions by 2050. And the natural resource sector is perhaps one of the best ones positioned to be effective in this regard, not only in reducing its own emissions, but absorbing the emissions of other sectors. And so it is agriculture and forestry are probably the only two land uses that can achieve a negative greenhouse gas emission inputs because of their ability to reduce their own output and also absorb emissions from other sectors. And a lot of progress has been made here. Just to give one example, my boss, Ned Sullivan at Scenic Hudson, sits on the state's Ag and Forestry Advisory Panel to the Climate Action Council. And our very own local Assemblywoman Dee Dee Barrett and Senator Michelle Henchy have been in a leadership role promoting carbon farming studies and other important policy initiatives throughout the state. Currently, right now, there's really a great new law that's been proposed by both Dee Dee, Michelle, and Assemblyman Donna Lopardo, chair of the Agriculture Committee in the Assembly, called the Climate Resiliency, Soil Health and Climate Resiliency Act. And what it does is really update a section of law that has not been looked at very deeply since the Dust Bowl, maybe a little bit in the 1980s. It includes the first ever definition of soil health and soil health practices in law. It establishes a new program essentially within the Department of Ag and Markets to support farmers in adopting soil health initiatives. It creates a voluntary soil health standard because there's nothing like a goal to motivate people that would not be uniform, but really be tailored to different soil types and regional economies around the state. It codifies a grant program known as the Climate Resilient Farming Initiative that provides grants through soil and water conservation districts to farmers to help reduce their own emissions. And importantly, it directs soil and water conservation districts, who are the primary deliverers of technical information and support to farmers, along with our cooperative extension network, directs them to address soil health and climate issues. So a lot of good opportunity there. So I think the real exciting question to me is what this means at the local level. And you all are on the front lines of that, and it would just only draw everyone's attention briefly to Ulster County Executive Pat Ryan's Green New Deal, which he came out with just a few weeks ago. And one of the things included in there is they want to create a roundtable discussion group to begin thinking about what the role Ulster County could have in encouraging farmers to do more on this issue. So there's a lot to unpack there, a lot to think about, but as we think about next steps, it's a real exciting time to think about what the role of local government can be in being part of this solution.
Thank you so much, Andy. Really exciting to see this stuff actually popping up in law. That's really great. Okay, so next we have Michael Sweeton, who is a town supervisor, joining us from outside of our Hudson Valley territory for our pilot here, but still a neighbor down the way in Orange County. So Michael is he's the town supervisor of Warwick, which actually has a massive amount of agricultural lands down in Orange County. And he's been involved with local government since the 90s. So he's seen a lot in his day. And we invited him because he was a leader in something very innovative, which was one of the first, if not the first, real estate transfer tax. And so he's going to talk a bit about that and how that tax actually has successfully preserved a lot of farmland in his town. He's also got a lot of experience when it comes to smart growth planning and zoning principles. And he's really had a big impact as a town supervisor there locally. So we're really so appreciative of you spending your time with us, Michael, and sharing your story of really being a change maker in your town. So I'm hoping these ideas will spark some inspiration for our local champions here. So why don't you go ahead and share your screen.
All right, well, thank you very much. And it made me sound like I've been around a long time. I guess I have. So let's see here. So let's get right into it. I've been supervisor for 20 years. I had a horticulture business in Warwick for 40 years. Back in the late 90s, our town recognized that farmland was getting gobbled up, and they really stressed that was what they wanted to see preserved. So the town, I got elected in 2001. The town took a sort of a multifaceted approach to this, which did include zoning changes, cluster developments, preserving 50% or more of the land is open. That's now really been about 60 to 65% on those kind of subdivision type things. But Orange County, we were really a big agricultural community, still our largest industry today, even though we're only 50 miles from New York City. And finally, it took many years to convince people that they needed to understand where their local food came from, or where their food came from, and that local food was important. They finally get that idea. So a lot of our farmers have taken that opportunity to produce food for the people in the lower Hudson Valley and in New York City. But part of that was, preserving farms. How do we go about preserving farms? We've got a very diversified mix of farms in our town. We have 8,000 acres of muck land or black dirt, which you can't build on, and that's diversified. We have another 8,000 or so upland acres that we're growing various things, orchards, beef cattle, goats being produced now, grains, hemp being grown, hops, and then all the ancillary things that we've allowed farmers to do through our zoning. We try to be very flexible with them to give them a lot of opportunities. I put these two pictures up because they're taken from the top of Mount Peter, looking down into the Warwick Valley. And the one on the left was taken in 1960, and the one on the right was taken last Thursday. So you can see we've managed to preserve the same view shed that we had then through being proactive in farmland development. This is just a couple of shots of our farms. We, when they come into our program, we do give them a sign that they're able to display proudly at their farms. This is a dairy farmer in Warwick. We still do have few dairy farms, although that's very tough to do in New York, but especially in the lower Hudson Valley. So again, in the late 90s, people really want to preserve agriculture. They gave the town board authority to bond $9.5 million for farmland preservation. They had done a build out analysis to show what would happen if we built out under the zoning and what that would look like. People didn't like that. We worked a year, that board right before me had worked a year to try to craft new zoning. It was very contentious, and the most contention came from large landowners who were farmers. They felt upzoning, which is what normally municipalities did then, was a stealing of their investment, and it was very hard fought. The zoning was good though. It was focused on cluster development, preserving space, and at the same time, with the $9.5 million authorization, we were giving farmers another option. I was elected with two other members. We passed the zoning, and we committed to the purchase of development rights program. At the time, the town's focus was what the state was offering, which was 75%, and those in favor of this program said, we'd like you, the landowner, to donate the other 25%. You can imagine that didn't really sit well with farmers who were working really hard to make a living on their farms. So we committed to pay 100% of those development rights. And that just sort of opened the door. One or two large farms that had fought the zoning realized that it was for them a good move, and it made a lot of sense, right? So because that happened and it was so successful, we were quickly going through the $9.5 million pretty rapidly. And we didn't feel like the town residents had any appetite for us to go back to them for more. So we began to look around what were alternatives. We did find that the 5 towns, which were the first on in New York, 5 towns on the East End of Long Island, had got authority for a real estate transfer tax. And we looked at that and we said, well, if they can do it, why can't we do it? And 5 or 6 years of effort that took various ways to try to do this, we were finally successful. And it was a long process, and we learned about legislation. Andy can probably tell you better than I, but it's you don't want to know how the sausage is made, I'll tell you that. But we were able to stick with it because we thought it was so very important to us. We finally got onto the floor of the legislature, and it passed overwhelmingly. Governor Pataki signed it in 2006. And as part of that, you have to hold a referendum in your town. And we mounted a campaign to do that. We had a lot of good advice from the Nature Conservancy. They had, in Long Island, the real estate industry had fought it very vigorously. It didn't play out for us as much. It was local realtors and a few builders that opposed it because it is a tax, right? It's a tax, and people don't like taxes. But it passed. It passed 55 to 45. It took effect in April of 2007. Our bill, unlike the one on Long Island, which was 2% transfer tax, we were advised along the way by a senator that if we reduced ours, it had a better chance. Well, that didn't really play into it. That wasn't really good advice. But nonetheless, we, at our final version, had reduced it to 0.75%. And it's on any real estate transfer in the town of Warwick. There are some exemptions. But essentially you get a credit of 100,000 on improved land and 50,000 on unimproved land. And it's paid by the buyer 9 times out of 10. Somebody pays it. So if the buyer were to balk and it really hasn't played out that the buyer has balked, the seller would pay it. So that's like a negative, but it doesn't really happen. So to date, it's generated almost $12 million. And farmers were just excited about the program because they realized the alternative was selling to developers, and a developer will come into your farm and throw a lot of big numbers around, but generally they only pay you a small portion up front and say, well, you'll get the rest when we get approval, which can take, in many cases, several years, maybe longer. Farmers are pretty smart, and they realize that if they wanted to get involved with us in a program, they generally could get their money in about a year or less. So we've used about $7 million, and we've leveraged another 6.7 million in federal, state, or land trust dollars. We have worked with Scenic Hudson in the past. And just with this transfer tax fund, we preserved 1,860 acres of working farms. Together with our PDR, it's a total of about 4,400 acres of the 8,000 upland acres that we had potentially available. I just threw this in because it shows you the plaques that we have in Town Hall that show all of the farms that are in our program. And you can see it's pretty extensive. We had to get 2 additional plaques, which is fine. What do you need to do to get a transfer tax? You got to get legislation passed. We introduced it as local home rule requests. Your senator and assemblyman. It's got to get out of committees, which is where they tie it up when they don't want it to get onto the floor. It has to get on the floor, and the governor has to sign it. Then you're obligated to have a mandatory referendum before your town. You have to prepare, prior to that referendum, a community preservation plan, and that maps out all of the properties you'd like to see preserved. It doesn't obligate anyone to anything. it just makes them eligible. And for 3 years after you pass this by referendum and it takes effect, you can't add to that plan. After 3 years, you can add properties to it. So it's important before you get to the referendum to really map out those critical properties that you do want to keep in a program. And I just want to say that we just closed on our 42nd farm, and we took advantage of New York State's Ag and Markets newer program, which was where they pay you more than the 75% to reduce the underlying land value for young farmers. And we did a property where someone who had 2 other farms in the program, he bought another piece of land that was going to have 55 homes on it. And he did that part of the program, and he's turning that other farm over to a young woman who raises goats and is leasing land at the moment. So we're very encouraged about that. We have two farms right now, 3 farms right now, another 300 acres in the process. The other important thing that the community preservation having the transfer tax did for us was it gave us a pool of money by which we could match either state or federal money or private land trust money. And that just made us very competitive in the land preservation business. And that's really a big part of our success. But again, Andy mentioned it, farming is about economics, and the farmers have to be able to make a living. And so we're giving them value. We're giving them their development value. They still own the land. They can sell the land. But we also make it pretty easy for them to diversify and do different things. And I think that's one of the keys you have if you want to continue to have a farm presence. You've got to give them some flexibility. Some will embrace it, some won't, and that's okay. But they do need that opportunity. So that's all I have. I got to stop sharing my screen now. And good.
Michael, thank you so much. It's very inspiring what you've been able to accomplish. Really appreciate your being here, telling us all that.
Yeah, and I wanted to congratulate you because I feel like you've accomplished so much, and it's definitely been an inspiration to other municipalities. Like coming up in a session soon, you guys, we're going to have Jen Metzger, who just got something through similar for Ulster County, and Robert McKeon, who did something similar preserving agricultural lands in Red Hook. And the other point I definitely wanted to underscore was you need to have the community planning in place to be able to do this sort of thing. So the work that you all are doing with natural resources inventories, comprehensive plan with sustainability elements, with your open space plan, all those are all building blocks as you're building towards this better future. So keep that in mind.
Could I just chime in here real quickly, just to throw another resource out there on the Community Preservation Act. Following up on the recent success of the measure in New Paltz, we are actually putting together a training program for municipalities that can learn from the efforts in Warwick, Red Hook, Long Island, and now New Paltz that can walk municipal leaders through step by step everything that goes into a campaign. And we've developed that with the Nature Conservancy and the public land that Michael referenced as other important partners here. So if you're interested in doing this and kind of getting beyond the case studies, we're happy to provide that kind of technical framework for you to think through.
Amazing.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Andy. Next, I'm going to introduce Elizabeth Ryan, and I hope you can hear me. It just got very Wizard of Ozzy here. I've known Elizabeth actually for several years. I interviewed her for a project years ago. And so she is our farmer joining us today, and is as the owner of Breezy Hill Orchard in Ulster County. She studied cider making in England and has a degree in pomology from Cornell University. She bought Breezy Hill Orchard in Dutchess County in 1984 and has since expanded to operate 2 more orchards, including Stone Ridge Orchard in Ulster County. She's one of the founding Grow NYC Green Market Farmers, received the Cornucopia Award from Stone Barn Center for Food and Agriculture, and was a Smithsonian Fellow. So Elizabeth, we're so happy to have you here. Please take it away.
Hi, can you all hear me? Can everybody hear me? Okay, so wow, Warwick, what can I say? Warwick, you are an inspiration, Mike, because you have pulled off what we can only dream about, but we can dream about it in other places. So I think I'm a lens for a local farmer. I'm a progressive grower. I'm gonna walk you through very quickly who we are and then kind of get into my perspective on what some of the barriers and obstacles are and what some of the low-hanging fruit is at the local community. So I farm in 5 locations, in 6 towns, in 2 counties, and bring produce to 25 farmers markets. We were very small in the beginning. We've had a commitment to regenerative agriculture since the beginning. And I think I'm going to emphasize some of the financial and economic realities, because I'm a good example of someone who is a true believer in everything you guys represent, and yet we struggle to do it for a variety of reasons. We use vast quantities of fossil fuels in our agricultural and food delivery systems, an appalling amount. And we find it very challenging to wean off some of that. So just very quickly, this is a little diagram just to put it in a context. Oh, I haven't, John, am I sharing the screen? Yeah, can you guys see this?
We can't yet.
Okay. Thank God for my tech team. Share screen, okay, click the button. Okay, so this just should put it into context a little bit for you guys. Do you see that? I don't hear anybody.
Yep, we see it, thanks.
Yes, 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 okay. So we produce a lot of stuff. We're not atypical of market-oriented farms. It goes to New York City and local markets. Our New York City markets, getting product to New York City takes vast amounts of fossil fuels, but we distribute a lot of fresh, healthy food, often, you know, within 1 or 2 days of it getting picked. Our farms are very diversified. I want you to see these kind of habitat maps of the ecosystem. We've had a long commitment to not killing bees, to not using herbicides, to not using systemics, to farming in the most sustainable ecological way that we possibly can, proactively supporting the ecosystem from the biome of the soil. I'm an orchardist primarily. That's a form of permaculture. The orchard and cider making community is beginning to understand that because we don't till the soil, we actually play some very important roles that we think are not well understood in at least doing no harm, if not actual carbon sequestration. And this is a slide of 3 other orchards. You can see how vastly different the context. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the community context, because if you're thinking about climate resilience, you really have to think about the whole ecosystem. So I'm just going to make a couple of points. I think they've already been said, but and I think I may be quoting Andy or Commissioner Ball, but agriculture is the only industry, or one of the few, with the potential to not only reduce but actually offset emissions and to be in a net negative carbon status relative to other industries. Probably we all know that. Agriculture is a highly diverse biological, social, and economic system. I'm guessing that you would all agree with that. In order, and I was glad to hear both prior speakers make the point about the economic realities for farmers. In order to enact successful climate resilience, barriers have to be understood, positive incentives. Cash helps, right? I think that the Warwick example really shows that when you get the economic piece right, how fascinating to me that there was resistance People didn't want to do it, but when the numbers started to tie out and farmers didn't have to pony up that big chunk of money, all of a sudden there was a lot more participation. And I want to make a point about technology. We are actually, I feel in many ways in the US, I've traveled quite a bit around the world, there are tremendous technologies that did not exist 30 to 50 to 80 years ago that would allow us to be on the cutting edge of green agriculture. And most of us, very simply put, cannot afford them. It's just that simple. It wasn't true, but what Israel, Germany, France, England, I could go on and on, have done. And that technology is out there. So one of the questions here is, that's a barrier. Why are our farmers not able to adopt these low input technologies? And I think actually it's not a question of philosophy. I think they just don't have the money to do it. Agriculture is a high cost, low margin, high risk enterprise that requires a whole community approach. I can't emphasize that enough. Rewards and incentives must both be tangible and intangible, social, financial, and spiritual. You know, a lot of farmers farm because they love it. Farmers markets, we'll talk about them later. They're important, not a panacea. There are a lot of other ways for farms to achieve a livelihood. Shared prosperity, this is very important to us on our farm. Every hand that touches the food. The farmer cannot bear the full cost of healthy, sustainable food and technological innovation. There have to be some offsets. So I had a chance to go through some of the materials that you guys were presented with as collateral for getting ready for this. And in particular, I'm gonna kind of hold it up. I don't know if you can see this, but I'm curious, there's a agricultural homework sheet. I don't know if anybody's had a chance to do that. I started an exercise this morning of filling this out for each one of the 6 towns that we actually farm in. One of our Stone Ridge Orchard actually straddles 2 towns. And I couldn't answer a lot of these questions myself, but I think that this is a very important piece. I wanted to encourage everybody to go through the process of filling this out, because I think it will begin to give you this critical asset and cultural inventory of what agriculture actually looks like in your community. Who are the farmers? You know, it's very different in Warwick, it's different in Germantown, it's different in Millerton. I'm one of the founders of the farmers market there. You know, these communities, some of them have lost all of their farmers. Agriculture is changing. Legacy farms are disappearing and being replaced by much smaller pocket farms. So new ways of thinking, community-based funding, there you go, Warwick. And maybe it's not a perfect model, but it's a damn good one. I think we have to think out of the box to create the pool of capital that's going to be needed to incentivize farmers and people who live and work on farms to participate in this. So I kind of did a little, just as a, to get us into maybe the next section where we actually answer some of these questions. But I was just noodling around and I did this little kind of concentric circle thing. So, and I was asking myself, and I think, you know, which are the things that can be done easily and which of the things that are very hard? And I tried to sort of, in my own mind, categorize them. So the center green one, biodiversity, I think most farms think that they're doing that pretty well. There's room for improvement. As an orchardist, we often think as a community in the eco-ag and the eco-apple program that I'm certified in, we think that we're kind of figuring that piece out. Energy usage, I think most of us feel like we're feeling pretty miserably. Converting to solar, some have, some haven't. Social ecosystem, that's something we don't really talk about, but where do employees live? Do they live on the farm? Do they drive an hour and a half to get there? Do they have green, affordable housing? This is part of the social fabric of the farm that actually allows us to lower our overall carbon footprint. And then we have the large externalities. This is something growers talk about ad nauseum, and we're very, very far away in terms of electric trucks, green packaging, recycling. This has been a primary focus for my Eco Apple organization. They think a lot about that outer ring. So what does that mean at the local level? Well, I think you could ask a bunch of interesting questions, and you begin to interact with local zoning rules. You know, can you house employees on the farm? Can you build them a greenhouse? Can you have multiple dwellings? Can you sell enough of your produce locally, or do you have to truck it far away? Are there incentives on packaging? I think one of the great examples of a policy initiative has been the banning of plastic bags, which has been phenomenally successful and has had a tremendous impact on everybody. So I'm going to try to get out of this screen now, but I think my role here is to help you ask some questions and to kind of, I think it's critical that farmers are stakeholders. And when they're stakeholders, you know, it works. And when they're not stakeholders, where it's too expensive, I mean, this is simplistic, but a lot of these things don't work unless there's a way to pay for it. And I think I'm done here, and I'm going to try to get out of the screen.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth.